Indian veterans and media fraternity. Well, also the politicians, they say Operation Sindoor is not yet finished.
Attack on that train, on the Jaffa Express train,
Yeah.
which was carried out by Baluch militants. India is indirectly internationalizing the Kashmir issue itself.
Who won the war? South Asian geopolitics, particularly for Pakistan, which is trying to balance ties with the key players.
Some pretty significant high-level engagements between the Pakistanis and the Iranians in recent weeks. I mean, the fact that you had a large delegation that included the army chief and the prime minister in Iran.
Michael, hi. Thank you for joining us. Let's get right to it because, there's a lot to talk about and I really don't want to waste time. The recent flare-ups between India and Pakistan weren't just tactical skirmishes. They reflected something deeper about deterrence, perception, and regional power balances. Would you agree that this marks a turning point in South Asia's strategic trajectory?
Well, first of all, thank you for featuring me in your on your platform. So yes, I do agree with your theory there. I mean, if you look at the nature of that conflict, brief though it was very concerning in that it represented, to my mind, uh, the most intense use of force, the most intense set of hostilities between India and Pakistan since the two countries formally became nuclear states in 1998. And as you know, there's been other cases when they fought against each other, including a war, the Kargil War in 1999. But if you look at the nature of what happened over those few days in May, you're talking about missiles and drones being
Oh,
sent
yeah.
deep into the other's territory. And that's pretty significant. And that clearly raises questions about nuclear escalation risks because, of course, all of these previous uses of force had been well below the nuclear threshold, and that had been the case with this most recent conflict as well. But you think about it, the more intense hostilities that take place below the nuclear threshold, the more risks that you bump up against that nuclear ceiling. So I think that it certainly is something that's very concerning for the region, but for the world as well.
It is indeed. And the war escalation, given the recent military confrontation, as we've discussed before as well, and you've just said it, it's not only India and Pakistan, there's another nuclear power here in the region as well. And obviously, things can escalate. Do you think things could have escalated or they can escalate in near future? Because we still keep on listening to statements coming from Indian veterans and media fraternity. Well, also the politicians, they say Operation Sindoor is not yet finished. Do you see it's escalating anytime soon?
Yeah, I mean, the ceasefire in place is a very fragile one, and that's because we know that at the moment when it was concluded, the relationship between the two countries was extremely tense, and it remains so. And indeed, the speech that Prime Minister Modi made soon after the ceasefire, suggested that India would be perfectly comfortable picking up the fight. I mean, Modi did stipulate that only if India is hit by terror again would it respond. But of course, the implication there from Modi and from others in the Indian government is that any terrorist attack that takes place on Indian soil will be essentially assumed that it was sponsored by Pakistan or that it originated in Pakistan. So, to me, that suggests that the next time there's a terrorist attack in India, no matter who might have been behind it, suggests a very high likelihood that India would respond militarily against Pakistan in ways that could be quite robust and quite intense. I don't think that. I mean, my sense is that India would not want to provoke another conflict right away. I think it wants to focus on other things like its strategic competition with China, among many other things. But the comments that the Prime Minister Modi made and the tone of his comments suggests that India certainly does not necessarily view the ceasefire as the end of the story when it comes to the conflict.
Yeah, and obviously, when you're talking about that, whatever happens in India, they're going to blame Pakistan just like that. So there's a lot happening in Balochistan, as we all know, and Pakistan did show the dossiers, and we did have Kulbhushan Jadhav. So Do you think if there's a tit for tat from Pakistan, how sensible it's going to be for the region? Because, you know, it can.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just a very volatile state of play. I mean, we know that we've been seeing an upsurge in attacks carried out by the BLA and its allies in recent years, and indeed in recent months. And it's notable that the the terror attack in Pahalgam and the broader conflict that came from it, this all happened fairly soon after that horrible attack on that train, on the Jaffa Express train,
Yeah.
which was carried out by Baluch militants. So, I think that we have to look at this all in the broader context, and it certainly has, a number of implications, troubling implications for the broader stability considerations and on the subcontinent. And it's all the more ironic given that for several years, going back to early 2021, the India-Pakistan relationship was actually on a relatively stable place, right? I mean, if you look at other tensions that Pakistan faced, it was tensions with Afghanistan were going up with the Taliban after the Taliban returned to power, and you even had some, the border heating up with Iran, where you had that brief military crisis between Pakistan and Iran last year. The truce between India and Pakistan, the LOC truce in 2021, really brought tensions down to a considerable degree. Given that this is the India-Pakistan relationship, the best one could describe it as was a cold peace. But still, there was more stability in that relationship. The LOC was relatively quiet, but of course, everything blew up figuratively and literally very quickly. And now I'd argue the India-Pakistan relationship will be very difficult to salvage. And it's not we're not necessarily going to see the historical precedent play out again, where after there's a big crisis or conflict between India and Pakistan, that the two settle down and are able to engage in some limited cooperation. I don't see that happening this time around.
Definitely not, because when you talk about in this water treaty in particular, that it's coming constantly that we're going to cut off water and things like that. And of course, if you listen to Bilawal Bhutto Zardari from Pakistan or other people from Pakistan, they say it's a war. So it's not coming down. The temperature is not coming down any soon. But U.S.'s role and Trump's statements. How do you view the current U.S. position in South Asia and these rising tensions? Trump did make some statements recently. Do you think his narrative signals a policy shift?
I think that this messaging coming from President Trump, it says more about Trump as a person, as an individual, than it does about U.S. policy. What I mean by that, as he is someone who views himself as the ultimate deal maker, as the ultimate peace broker. And so, naturally, he is someone that would be very happy to position himself at the center of these ceasefire negotiations that, as I understand it, did not
Mm.
involve a direct U.S. role. I mean, yes, the U.S. did get involved and was engaged with both the Indian and Pakistani sides and encouraged them to talk. But when it came to the actual ceasefire talks, that neither Trump nor any U.S. official was directly involved, even though there was a U.S. role. But I think that for President Trump, he wants to be seen as the person that is instrumental in these types of difficult negotiations. And then when it comes to his most recent offer to mediate on Kashmir, again, I think that he is someone who's intrigued by the intractability of the Kashmir issue and the Kashmir dispute. And he genuinely would want to be the person, perhaps if it gets him a Nobel Peace Prize, to be at the center of that. So it's notable that we have not heard other officials in the Trump administration call for the U.S. to mediate on Kashmir. It's just been Trump. Though of course he takes the lead on these things at any rate. So if you sort of like broaden the scope and you could look at the fact that yes, there's been a lot of high level engagement between the U.S. and Pakistan in recent weeks, of course, including the fact that the Pakistan Army chief was hosted at the White House by President Trump. An
Yes.
extraordinary development. We've never had
Yes.
that happen with the Pakistan Army chief, who's not also head of state. But I think that really comes down to, again, Trump and his personal, he's very intrigued by and respects power. and strength.
Right.
And I think he sees that in Munir, who of course was promoted to a field marshal, which again, something that rarely happens in Pakistan. So let's see how things play out. I think when it comes to issues like critical minerals and crypto and things like that, those are big buzzwords now. And there's a lot of talk about how the
Right.
US and Pakistan can strengthen their ties by using those issues as new pillars. I think that it could take a long time to get to a point where there's substantive cooperation on those levels. Counterterrorism, maybe that could be a bit different. I think there is some scope for limited cooperation there, but I think that there's still going to be a need for these two countries to figure out how they can best engage in the second Trump era.
Right. I would also like to know, since you've mentioned Kashmir, and Mr. Trump also mentioned Kashmir in one of his posts after that, and many of the Indian veterans were not very comfortable with this because they thought after the abrogation of Article 370, it just turned into an internal matter somehow. And now we see the world's talking about it. Do you see it resolving? I mean, it's a straight question anytime.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if the world's talking about it. I mean, I know that this has long been a foreign policy goal of Pakistan to get the Kashmir issue on the international community's agenda. And of course, we had this very distinguished Pakistani delegation that traveled to the U.S. and to several other countries in the West, as well as Russia, to convey Pakistan's position. But I don't necessarily think that we're seeing a lot of follow-on in that regard, but I would say this, and this is an irony, and I'm sure that you would agree that India very much seeks to avoid internationalizing. It wants to avoid the internationalization of the Kashmir issue, but invariably by invariably when it starts highlighting Pakistan and makes these accusations about Pakistan, cross-border terrorism, all of that, invariably that invites Pakistan to put out its own position. And that
Right.
is that, ultimately we need to talk about the Kashmir issue. And, this conflict, this recent conflict, which raised the world's concerns about about nuclear escalation risks, it prompted Pakistan's government to deploy this very distinguished group of former diplomats and parliamentarians and all to give Pakistan's side, Pakistan's position, and that has to entail the Kashmir issue. So I would argue that India is indirectly internationalizing the Kashmir issue itself, just because of the way in which these events play out in terms of the sequencing of them. But that said, one could talk about how successful the Pakistani delegation was in its travels to Washington and elsewhere. I think it was successful in some regards, but when it comes to the Kashmir issue, I just really think, to be very honest with you, that most of the world, other than some of Pakistan's closest allies, just feel it's better to sort of step away and keep away from that, which at the end of the day entails taking India's position, which is for the international community not to get involved in this dispute.
Right, but that's absolutely. I don't know if we can call it a double standard. Maybe we can, because if we see that given the Indus Water Treaty, it was brokered under the assumption of stable political ties. How viable it is today when India uses water as a pressure tool, especially amid renewed conflict over Kashmir. It is renewed as far as we're concerned because we believe that as much as we've seen, nobody was talking about it, but now somehow it came through American presidents exposed, and a couple of people did talk about maybe there's just start. Do you think it's a double standard that the world is completely silent on this militarized zone and a lot happening there?
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to interests, right? I mean, I'll get to your Indus Waters Treaty point in a second, but I mean, as you know, much of the international community is keen to engage with India, even though, some countries have more reservations than others about that. And if not wanting to engage for strategic reasons, which is the case that you have with
Right.
many of the countries in the West, it's to engage for reasons of commercial interest, investment. That's what you get with so many countries across the Middle East and the Gulf. And they've concluded that it's best not to rock the boat with India on the Kashmir issue. Coming back to the Indus Waters Treaty, this is a big deal for sure, and I think this is this is where Pakistan, I think, could really make an impactful effort globally. To be very honest with you, I think that many in Washington and elsewhere don't really understand, first of all, what the Indus Waters Treaty is, the
Okay.
significance of it, and the implications of India's move. And, the fact that Pakistan is a water-stressed country and that climate change effects are making that worse. In today's Washington, it's not necessarily going to be helpful if you start talking about climate change effects. But yeah, at the end of the
Right.
day, I think that Pakistan, can make a very strong argument that this move by India, if it's not reversed, and I don't think India has any desire or intention to come back into the Indus Waters Treaty anytime soon. The longer term impacts of India suspending it, holding it in abeyance, the impacts on Pakistan's water security, on its economic growth, on public health, and so much could be quite strong. And the fact that it is, as you know, a treaty that was co-signed by the World Bank, meaning it has, it's a bilateral treaty, but it has international
Yes.
legitimacy as well. That all suggests that, the international community could be brought on board to the idea that India's move is a pretty significant one, and one that could have very problematic implications for Pakistan down the road. I think this issue, more so than the Kashmir one, is something that could resonate for in many international capitals if Islamabad is able to be successful in making that strong case.
Right. Now, talking about Bangladesh, since we're talking on Pak-Bangla Connect, so, Bangladesh appears to be distancing itself from India and Indian influence after Hasina's oust her and realigning with China and potentially warming up to Pakistan, talking about multiple things. And, how serious is this realignment in your opinion? And what implications does it hold for India's neighborhood first policy? Also, we know that the relations with Nepal were strained at a point, and we know that Maldives they ran India out campaign before President Moizu took oath, and we also know there are multiple things happening in the region. So if maybe we can safely say that there's so many people who are having complaints from India, and Bangladesh is visibly tilting towards China and Pakistan. How do you see that?
Yeah, so Sadia, I really think that this Pakistan Bangladesh thing is really important. There's been a lot of notable geopolitical shifts in the region over the last few years, and I would argue that developments with Pakistan and Bangladesh, which of course stem from Sheikh Hasina's departure, it's really one of the big game changers for South Asian geopolitics in the sense that there really wasn't much happening at all with Pakistan-Bangladesh relations for a number of years, and certainly during those 15 years that Hasina was in power. You did have some developments when Imran Khan was prime minister. There was an exchange of letters between Sheikh Hasina and Khan. It didn't really amount to much, though, at the end of the day. And so, indeed, as you suggest, Bangladesh, or as you say, Bangladesh was quite close to India. And Sheikh Hasina had this very special personal relationship with both the BJP and the Congress in India. I mean, let's not forget that going back to the early days of Bangladesh's independence, that
Oh, yes.
Sheikh Hasina's father, her family had close ties with the Gandhi family in the
Yes.
Congress. So yes, it's very significant that Pakistan and Bangladesh have essentially resumed trade. There's been some engagements between the senior security officials in both countries. This is very important, for sure. Um, but I would say this, I don't think we should overstate just how far things have gone with Bangladesh and Pakistan just yet. Do you look at trade? Yes, I think there's potential for example, Pakistan to supply parts and other supplies for Bangladesh's RMG sector and its factories. But at the end of the day, Pakistan and Bangladesh, you could actually view them somewhat as economic competitors, right? Because in both cases, their main exports are textiles or garments. So they'll have to work their way around that. Beyond that, and this gets to some interesting things. I think that Bangladesh is the interim government definitely does not want to feel constrained by India. It wants to do what it wants, including strengthen relations with China, with Pakistan. It's not going to worry as much as it might have used to about what India thinks. But recall what happened a few weeks ago when there was that summit in China, that China South Asia summit, when you had senior diplomats from China, Pakistan and Bangladesh meet. Remember that? And so
Yeah.
after that, you had Pakistani and Chinese officials depict this as the first of a big new trilateral mechanism for cooperation. But the Bangladesh government had a very different reaction. It was not signing on to this idea of a new formal trilateral mechanism. And I think that was Bangladesh maybe signaling that it wants to be cautious about just how far it goes. Bangladesh, of course, doesn't do alliances, and maybe it thought that a trilateral cooperation mechanism would sound too much like an alliance. But also keeping in mind this, that we're getting fairly close to an election in Bangladesh. It's going to
Yes.
happen maybe by April next year. And I think there might
Yes.
have been a view that maybe this interim government shouldn't go too far with its foreign policy in terms of a major shift, given that this interim government, it doesn't have a public mandate. It's unelected. Maybe it would want to be a bit careful in that regard. And the final point I'll make here is that some of the harshest critics of India in this interim government in Bangladesh were the student leaders, and many of them have left the government to form their new party, which they're trying to build out in preparation for the election. So it's a bit more complicated than it might seem. But all that said, yes, the Bangladesh-Pakistan relationship is something to behold. Fine. In terms of the second part of your question, India and the region, very briefly,
Mm.
India faces what I would describe as a structural and a strategic constraint. The structural constraint is not new. That is that in the power asymmetry at play. India is, of course, the largest, most powerful, most populous country in the region, and that I think inherently has seeded some levels of distrust and concerns on the part of many of the smaller states in South Asia. I'm not talking about Pakistan. I'm talking about others, and particularly when
Mhm.
it comes to India's policies, how it engages in its business. This has, I think, fueled perceptions of India even being meddlesome and bullying in the neighborhood. That's one challenge it's had to deal with for a while. The strategic challenge, the newer one, which you alluded to, is that, in recent months, half the SARC region has had new leaders that have taken more pro-China positions than their predecessors, certainly Bangladesh, Nepal, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. I think India can leverage its strong economic relationships with these countries, but still, that's going to be a challenge. And the final challenge that I would argue here is public sentiment. I mean, we've seen
Oh, yes.
in some of the countries in South Asia, particularly the Muslim majority countries, rising levels of anti-India sentiment, which is rooted in, the Modi government's policies, Hindutva, and all of that. So that's certainly something for India to navigate, even as I feel it's been able to manage that relatively well. Other than Pakistan and Bangladesh, its relations with countries around the region, including with Afghanistan, interestingly, are fairly workable and cordial.
Yeah, you've spoken about public sentiment, so that's pretty against India as far as Bangladesh is concerned, because I'm sure you know about it, that just in recent past, there was a survey in Bangladesh on a television channel, and that was about 79% of them were against India. So the public sentiment is really high. So fingers crossed after the elections are done, how things unfold. Let's see how they will. Well, as far as this region is concerned, yes, exactly. The sentiment is there, but probably China is still. Let's see again, fingers crossed. But thank you so much for your comment on that. Now, moving on to something very interesting we've seen in recent past for last 10, 12 years, particularly the narrative war is kind of, it's very different than what it used to be before after the internet and also, and the disinformation and the misinformation. How do you assess the information warfare being waged in this region? India's been pushing strong narratives globally. How effective has Pakistan been in countering them? Like primarily important. So I give you one example. One of their mainstream media journalists made fifth floor in Serena Hotel, Kabul. What's quite funny because it never existed, and they made a seaport in Lahore. Again, very funny, hilarious. And then the war bunkers, the media houses became war bunkers, and we kept on seeing those exaggerated statistics and figures and all. How do you see it's moving? It's creating more chaos. And of course, as far as Pakistan is concerned, how do you see it's handling this thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the big story about how misinformation and disinformation has begun to mark, if not in some cases, define and drive India-Pakistan relations. And if you look at what happened during the most recent conflict, there's so many examples of some of the big Indian TV channels coming out with the most obviously fake news. I mean, how could anyone not know it's not true? I mean, such as the the big breaking news that that Pakistan's army chief had been arrested and that the Karachi port had been blown up. I mean, you have people on social media based in Karachi stepping
Just to
outside.
interject you for a moment, have you been to Pakistan, Michael? Have you ever been to
Oh,
Pakistan?
yeah, absolutely, many times.
Have you been to Lahore?
I have.
Have you seen the seaport there?
Yeah.
So that was my
Exactly.
example. I thought you might have. Yeah. So,
Yeah, no, I've had the fortune to travel to Pakistan almost at least once a year, going back
okay.
many
Right.
years. Anyway, so this is, I think, obviously when you're looking at a tense relationship, when it's plunged into crisis and conflict, you can't afford to have disinformation because that stokes emotions, it fuels anger and mistrust, and it just gets people more upset at a time when you least need that, or when you can least afford that. So yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing issue, and I think that technology. I mean, we could talk about why, like sort of the strategic motivations for misinformation, disinformation, but I think it's important to point out the technological factor as well, right? I mean, the emergence of AI has meant that
Mhm.
it's much easier to create more believable fake news videos and
Oh,
imagery,
yes.
right? I mean, these deep fakes that we saw prevail
Yes.
throughout the conflict, they look, a lot of them look real, relative
They
to
do.
what we'd seen
They do.
earlier. And if that's the case, people will just feel, those behind them will just feel more motivated to create more of them because at the end of the day, at least on social media, they want more engagement. They want more people
Oh,
looking at and
yes.
reacting to their fake news.
Oh, yes. So how do you handle with that? I mean, it's kind of personal question because people keep on coming with all the views and disinformation, and you've done a lot of work and just outright denying you. How does it feel, and how do you deal with it? Just a piece
Yeah,
of
I mean,
advice for us.
I myself have actually been the subject of disinformation. I've said some things that there have been some comments attributed to me on social media that I never said, and they've been put out
Oh,
there. And I think that sometimes you ignore it. If it's getting a lot of traction, you just put out a denial. But I think that this is where being, me being on the outside, not from India, not from Pakistan, but someone who's studied the region for many years, I do have that context and I know what's realistic and what's not. So, for example,
right.
during the most recent conflict, I actually had a few people ask me, they'd heard these reports that I knew that were not true, and they said, "Is this true?" And so, for example, one of them, as I'm sure you know, was that the BLA had taken over Quetta, and I knew
Oh
that there
my
was
God.
absolutely no reason that that could could be the case. And I said, "Well, look,"
Yeah.
and I explained why this would not be the case. You have to use logic and facts and things like
Right.
that, and then you make it. And I think that's what analysts, hope they should see as one of their jobs, independent analysts, is to try to understand and make clear to wider audiences, what is true and what is not. I mean, there are fact check services out there. Both the Indian and the Pakistani governments have them, but I think the best type of fact check services are the independent ones. You look to them. Sometimes fact check services can have a bias as well, quite frankly. But yeah, I mean, for me as an analyst, it's just about trying to, draw on logic, draw on facts to make clear that what's true and what's not. But this is just going to become a bigger challenge for us all because, as I
Right.
said, the technological factors, and I think that the Indian government and quite frankly the Pakistani government as well, conclude that sometimes it's helpful to have very particular narratives driving debates and discussions, and if those narratives require drawing on some misinformation to strengthen them and bolster them, all the better. And it's very dangerous, but this is the
Right.
world we live
Yeah.
in.
Right. Well, we have to go to another debate to talk about how dangerous it's going to be in near future because when you read Yuval Harari, you just keep on thinking everything is going to go down. Anyhow, so talking about the narratives, and you've spoken about them at length, there's a very straight question since you've done a lot of work regarding this region. The straight question is that there are so many claims from India and Pakistan. whose claims are correct, because we keep on listening to many people talking about, from India in particular, that we did this. Just recently, Mr. Ajit Doval gave a complete speech and it was amplified, and everybody was like over their, over the moon that we've done something great. So, how do you see it? What, as an independent, unbiased analyst, you say, who won the war? Somebody did.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a debate that so many have had, and my answer, which is perhaps the safe fence sitting one, is that
I understand.
both sides could easily claim victory, right? I mean, India was able to penetrate the Pakistani airspace significantly, and it hit a number of strategic spots, including the Norcon Air Base. Even though Pakistan had this fancy Chinese technology, this air missile defense technology, it didn't stop India from doing some damage. Whereas Pakistan was able to at a very minimum, hold its own against India, and B, it was able to inflict some damage itself, including downing, a number of Indian jets. I mean, I still don't know the true figure, five, six, whatever the case may be. And I think that there is this perception, quite frankly, among many in India and many outside, that Pakistan doesn't have the capacity to achieve parity with India in a conventional conflict. And that clearly is not true. I mean, we've seen that going back to 2019. But I think that there are many in India that thought that Pakistan would not respond to India's initial airstrikes. I mean, you and I could agree that it was definitely going to respond. So I think that's a victory for Pakistan as well. So, I think at the end of the day, this is why both countries, I believe, both governments were comfortable pursuing ceasefire talks and didn't necessarily need the Trump administration to be pushing them to do it, because they had reached a point where they could comfortably, confidently claim victory and take that back to their respective publics, which they did, right? I mean, I would argue that many in both India and Pakistan feel that their countries won, so to speak.
Right.
So I think that that's the best way that I respond to that. But I'll say this, going back to your question of whose claims are right. There were a lot of claims that were right. There were a lot of claims that weren't right. I think that on the Indian side, especially because of the loudness of their media and so on, that there was an especially large number of claims that the Indian side made, not always through the government, but through the media and commentators that were clearly wrong. And then if in sort of in a different context, as you know, it took a very long time for India to acknowledge that its jets were shot down, right? And
Right.
you had independent analysts who were getting, hate and all types of abuse from Indian commentators for saying, based on, their information, the facts that they
Yes.
had, that there were Indian jets shot down. But it took a very long time for India's government to admit to that, which is, I think, a whole other dimension to this. Final point I'll make on this, and I make this point a lot when it comes to disinformation, not just in an India-Pakistan context. Unfortunately, the risk here is that you can have a boy who cried wolf effect, right? When it comes to disinformation, that if there's so many things that are wrong, that are fake, that are put out there, that invariably, once audiences see that a particular entity or government or media space or whatever is saying things that aren't true, whenever they say things that are true and are important, there's going to be the risk that people will just be skeptical and think that anything that's said at any time is going to be wrong and is going to be false. And this is something that I've pointed out in Afghanistan since the Taliban came back to power. A lot of fake news in the early months after the Taliban returned to power about all these horrible things attributed to the Taliban that it didn't actually do. However, there were a lot of really terrible things that the Taliban have done since coming back to power. And I think the risk is that there's so much disinformation alleging things that they didn't do, then the risk is that many people won't believe that the bad things that the Taliban are doing in terms of brutalities against women are not happening either. So it's really a very complex dynamic, but I think definitely a very, very concerning one with a lot of impact.
Absolutely. So Israel-Iran conflict, we'll just quickly go through that. A ripple in South Asia with the Israel tensions rising and Iran leaning towards China-Russia bloc. How do you see this playing into South Asian geopolitics, particularly for Pakistan, which is trying to balance ties with the key players?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously Pakistan perhaps more impacted by any other country in the region from that conflict, just because of the border and because of the large Shia community in Iran, pardon me, in Pakistan, and because of the what appears to have been what some pretty significant high level engagements between the Pakistanis and the Iranians in recent weeks. I mean, the fact that you had a large delegation that included the army chief and the prime minister in Iran just a few weeks before Israel's airstrikes began against Iran. That's pretty significant. I actually think that at the end of the day, I mean, one can talk about domestic political implications for Pakistan, but I won't go into that. I think in your context, it's better to look at the broader geopolitical consequences. I think Pakistan actually benefited in the sense that I think Pakistan has been trying to deepen its ties with Iran ever since the Saudi Arabia-Iran rapprochement deal was signed several years ago, because that, in my view, it created more space for Pakistan to engage with Iran. Of course, Pakistan has this long-standing alliance with Saudi Arabia, which I think limited just how much it could do with Iran, given the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. But that rapprochement deal opened up more space, but there were still some issues, right? Cross-border violence, and we saw how that played out with the brief military clash between Iran and Pakistan last year. Um, and I think some other issues had made it difficult for them to move forward. But when you look at this war, this conflict, um, you know, clearly, I mean, Pakistan was fully behind Iran. It was very, unequivocally in support of Iran, unequivocally opposed to the Israeli strikes and later to the U.S. strikes. Um, and I think that helped bring Pakistan and Iran closer together. I mean, there's a level of solidarity there. I mean, there was full moral diplomatic support coming to Iran uh, from the Pakistani government, and I think that's something that Tehran will notice. Pakistan will still need to navigate its ties with the Saudis and with the other Arab Gulf states, but I think
Right.
that this conflict, the silver lining for Pakistan, is that it has, I think, brought the two countries a bit closer together.
Right. So again, coming back to the narrative for a while, Pakistan's diplomatic opening at the UN and OIC you must have seen. Do you think Pakistan's recent success in building narrative support at the UN and OIC forums signals a genuine diplomatic resurgence, or it's more symbolic? Also, we haven't seen like whatever India was saying. They were saying that Pakistan has to be blamed directly. It wasn't a direct blame from anybody across the globe. OIC UN never said anything like that. Even India's closest allies didn't. How do you see this?
Yeah, so Sadia, I go back to something I said before, that when I was talking about the Pakistani delegation that traveled around to try to make Pakistan's case, and I said that it was successful in some areas, was not in others. I talked about how it was not successful in the Kashmir front. This is an area where I think it was successful. Um, and that is because, yes, I mean, you're right that India has not provided any evidence publicly to indicate any connection, any Pakistan connection to the Pahalgam
Right.
attack, or any connection to Pakistan-based groups. Um, but here, and India's concern was, of course, that yeah, so few countries took its side. Very few countries were willing to support its actions throughout the conflict as a counterterrorism imperative. Only Israel, Taiwan supported that position. See, this is something that works against India, and that is that whenever you have, because of the conflict dynamics between India and Pakistan, these are two nuclear armed states. So whenever you have whenever they fight against each other, invariably the world's concerns are going to move toward nuclear escalation risks.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
much of the world, as you'll know, roundly condemned the Pahalgam attack, including India's rivals like China, strongly
Even
condemned the terrorist
Pakistan
attack.
condemned Pahalgam
Even
attack.
Pakistan, yeah, exactly. But the problem for India is that once it starts, fighting against Pakistan, and once you have an escalation in hostilities, the world's going to stop thinking about the terrorist attack that led to the conflict, and is going to think a lot more about nuclear escalation risks.
And
It's only
nuclear
natural.
arsenal.
And I think this is where
Absolutely.
Pakistan's delegation, that's one thing that it highlighted. I heard in the discussions I was present at with the delegation, a lot of focus on a lot of things, Kashmir and so on, but also this risk, the risk that's posed by these continued, tensions that could lead to clashes like this. And that strikes a chord, certainly. That hits a nerve in Washington and elsewhere because it's only natural for countries and governments to be worried about nuclear escalation risk. It's very rare for two nuclear armed countries to fight against each other, especially multiple times. So naturally, this is where India struggles, and I think this is where Pakistan is able to be effective in its messaging on the global stage.
This definitely is a point of concern. And our final question to you is future of South Asia's stability with deteriorating India-China ties. And just recently we saw the Dalai Lama visiting, and when we were talking about him, so you know what the recent developments are. So how do you see it shaping up here? The Afghan transition, shifting alliances. Do you believe South Asia is heading towards strategic fragmentation or forced recalibration?
That's a really great question. It deserves a whole separate discussion on its own. I mean, I'll only make a few brief
I would
comments here.
request to have a sequel soon, but you can
Yeah,
briefly comment on it here. Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, when I think about stability trajectories in South Asia, one of the things I think about most is borders, hot borders. I mean, it seems that now so many borders are hot. I mean, there are many disputed borders, but it seems that so many are hot. I mean, you look at Afghanistan and Pakistan, certainly India and Pakistan, the LOC is now hot again. Pakistan, Iran, you never know what could flare up there. And then you also have, we didn't really talk about this that much. The Bangladesh-Myanmar border is is
Oh,
is very
yes.
troubled now
Yes. Yes.
because, yeah, I mean, because of the fact that you now have a rebel group, the Arakan Army, that controls the territory bordering all of the territory bordering Bangladesh. This is very concerning for Bangladesh. And then, of course, the India-Bangladesh borders, they're always tense. So this is something that certainly concerns me. So I think that when I think about stability trajectories, that's one thing that I'm really going to be tracking.
Right. Thank you so much, Michael. It was a pleasure having you for our Pak Bangla Connect viewers. This is Michael, and he's been very kind because our first English vlog is with him, and I'm really honored and proud because he made it happen for us. So we'd request another sequel with you, Michael, soon because you're mostly analyzing, and frankly speaking, it's a lot to agree with most of the time than to disagree with. So really an in-depth analysis, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers are going to benefit from that. As far as this region is concerned, of course, we need stability. People here have been through a lot. There is a lot going on. And with nuclear powers escalating to this point, I think anybody, be it media fraternity, politicians, analysts, really need to think. We need to live. We need to grow. We need to develop. Yes, geopolitics is a lot more to be discussed. And of course, nation states do not work like that. They think about their own issues and problems. But I really wish that we start talking about things more rationally, more pragmatically, so we can actually have some peace in this region and a lot more development. So thank you so much, Michael, once again. We'd love to have you again with us and have a great Sunday. Taking out time for us on Sunday is really great. So thanks once again.
Thank you. Really appreciate the conversation. Thanks for having me.